Susan Spicka from the Education Voters of Pennsylvania joins us to talk about cyber charter schools, accountability, and a recent report that her organization just did. Susan, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Can you give our viewers an overview of what your organization does?
Yep, we are a small statewide nonprofit, nonpartisan policy and advocacy organization, and we are focused on ensuring that public schools in our communities have adequate, equitable, and constitutional school funding so all kids have an opportunity to learn.
And can you tell us, how are charter schools funded, and is there any distinction between a charter school with brick and mortar and a cyber school?
Yep, so in Pennsylvania, students are allowed to choose to go to a brick and mortar charter school or a cyber charter school. And when the student leaves their school district, the school district pays a tuition, makes a tuition payment for that student. In Pennsylvania, the tuition payment is based on the school district's spending per student average, and it's the same tuition for what a student who goes to a brick and mortar charter school and a cyber charter school. And Pennsylvania is really an outlier in the entire nation in funding cyber charter schools this way. So there is really no relationship between the tuition that a school district pays to a cyber charter school and the cost of the cyber charter school providing an online education to students in their homes.
How do those numbers compare around the state? What's the range, say, from the lowest to the highest number per student?
So I would say the lowest is about $8,000 per student for a regular education student, and that goes up to over $20,000 for a regular education student. For special education, that range is even higher and more diverse. So it probably ranges from about $20,000 a student for a special education student to over $60,000 per student for a student to attend a cyber charter school in Pennsylvania. And that is a tuition payment that the school district makes to the cyber charter school.
And you said there's no distinction between whether it's cyber or brick and mortar. Is that fair? Is that equitable? Because there seems like there'd be less costs associated if you don't have a brick and mortar, but maybe there's costs associated with the technology?
So, you know, when the law was written, you know, this was over 20 years ago, and the legislature didn't really distinguish between, you know, a brick and mortar and a cyber charter school. And when cyber charters started, they were very small, and, you know, it wasn't really a problem. As time has gone on, we have seen in other states where cyber charter schools have started to operate, and we have seen in Pennsylvania that the cost of providing an online education at home just simply is not the same as the cost of providing a student education in a building. And I think as we intuitively think about it, you know, school districts, they have buildings that they maintain, so they have facilities staff, they have to take care of the grounds, they have parking lots, they have buses, they have all of these facilities. A student who's learning at home on a computer, the cyber charter school does not have all of those costs, yet they are being paid as though they do. And so we've seen in Pennsylvania that these cyber charter schools are now what we like to say awash in excess funding. And when we look at their fund balances, many of these cyber charter schools have enormous fund balances. Some cyber charter schools are just starting to build these gigantic buildings all over the state. And the buildings aren't for students. The buildings are for adults, where adults will go and they will work in these buildings, which is a very big difference from having a building where a student, for taxpayers to pay for a building where there is a student who's going to a science laboratory, who's going to a music room, who's sitting in a classroom all day. The cyber charter buildings are buildings where primarily adults are working all day. And so, you know, there is a very big mismatch between the money that goes to the cyber charters and what they actually need to provide the education to the student at home. And we see it in their fund balances, and we see it in this like kind of real estate empire that a cyber charter is building.
Well, let's talk about the study that your organization did. You looked into the finances of Commonwealth Charter Academy. Can you tell us what you found?
Yep. So I used to be a school board member. And when I was a school board member, each month we would have 2 meetings, and we would, as school board members, approve the payment of the bills. And so we took a look at the check registers and the bills that Commonwealth Charter Academy was paying. We had to file a right-to-know request because these were not posted publicly online. And so we filed a right-to-know request and just said, like, let's just take a look at what they're spending money on. And when we dug into the more than 200 pages of invoices that we had for each school year, we saw some things that just didn't look like what you would typically see a school district spending money on. For example, hundreds and hundreds of payments for restaurants and dining, going to brew pubs and vineyards, going to, Cork and Fork, which is like a fancy restaurant downtown in Harrisburg. We found, payments for places like entertainment. So like the Pittsburgh Ballet, Falling Water, Maid of the Mist, Hershey Park, US Ninja Nook, Green Ridge Club, the Camelback Lodge, the Chattanooga Zoo. And we said, like, this just seems strange. Like, why are school tax dollars paying for these things? We found all these payments for vehicles, including, like a almost $60,000 car, which didn't really make sense in terms of, like, these are school tax dollars that are meant to educate students. They come from school districts that collect property taxes. These are not things that you would typically see a school district paying for. And so we decided to just take a deep dive in and see what we found. And, we found a lot that seemed to me and to many people to be a questionable use of school tax dollars.
Have you gotten any answers on some of the ones that you question, like, say, the Hershey Park expenditure? Was that something that was for students?
So we did file a supplemental right-to-know request back in November and to ask for the actual invoices that were paid. So we got the check registers. So it was a date, a check number, who it was paid to, and an amount. And so we've been waiting since November, and we are hopeful in the beginning of March that CCA will send over the invoices so that we can have a better understanding of what these payments were made for. There was one invoice, though, that we did get that we got as part of an earlier batch, and it was a $4,000 payment to the Hill Society, which is like a little club inside the Harrisburg Hilton, where people can go and enjoy. I think the Hill Society says where you can, like, go and enjoy the good stuff. Fine wine, whiskey, food, getaways, and special events. And that, again, like, there's someone who's paying property taxes to their school district, and those property taxes are being used to fund a membership to this, like, little club in a Harrisburg hotel.
Have you gotten any answers on that one, the Hill Society? What was the justification there? Or are you still waiting for an answer?
We did not get a justification. We just got a copy of the invoice, and that there were 3 executives. One is a former executive, and then two current executives who were listed as members who could go and enjoy this in Harrisburg on taxpayer dollar, but no explanation as to why.
So memberships for leaders of
Yes.
the school.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So you guys had to file a right-to-know request. Are there any schools, this is, for the record, this is the largest cyber charter in the state?
Correct. Largest cyber charter in the state. Correct.
Are there other cyber charters or charters who have this kind of information publicly accessible, say on a website or somewhere where you wouldn't have to go through formal channels to get it?
That's a good question. We have not done a deep dive into the other cyber charter schools and how they post their minutes, how they post their finances. We have not looked at that. I will say that for many years in a row, we have done a report looking at the expenditures that they have for advertising and promotion. And to get all of those put in one place for all 14 cyber charter schools, we have always had to file right-to-know requests. to get that type of expenditure from them. So,
how does it compare to regular public schools? How much disclosure, how much sunshine is there on the finances of a regular brick and mortar public school?
So for a typical, we have 500 school districts, and all of them are going to operate probably slightly differently. But I would say a typical experience for someone who would like to understand how their local school district is spending money, your school district will have an agenda online, and attached to the agenda will be the different items that the school board is going to vote on. So if they're approving payments, the items that they're paying for will be online. If they're approving contracts, the contracts will be attached. And that will all come out publicly at least 48 hours before the meeting. So if you want to go to the meeting, you can go and check this out, and you have time, and you can review it yourself. Simply by going to the website. And then when you want to ask questions about it, you can go to your school board meeting and you can ask questions about it. For Commonwealth Charter Academy, for CCA, they have once a month, they have a meeting. It's at 9 o'clock in the morning I think it's the second Wednesday of the month. Anybody who wants to can attend the meeting via Zoom, or you can go in person. But the agenda that they post does not have all the financial documents attached to it. If you would like to get the financial documents, which show you what the board is discussing and what they're voting on, a regular person has to contact CCA. You have to request it. They will send you an email, and then they will give you a code, and you can use a code to go in to download this material yourself. And the last board packet I got was over 200 pages long. And then if you fail to ask for it before the meeting, it's never posted online, and then you have to file a right to know request to get access to that information after the meeting. That is not going to be your typical experience if you are going to a local school board meeting.
How often are these things looked at? I don't want to call what you guys did an audit per se, but how often are cyber schools audited, or are their finances looked at?
So the cyber charters, I think they conduct their own audits with their own people. But the state of Pennsylvania, the Department of Education, is the authorizer for cyber charter schools. And it would seem to me that our state should be should have robust oversight over the finances of these cyber charter schools, which collect over $1 billion tax dollars a year. Our Auditor General has not touched them. He has not audited cyber charter schools. Most cyber charter schools have either never been audited, or it's been eight more years since their audit. So the Auditor General's office doesn't do it. The Department of Education also doesn't do it. And on top of that, when you're authorized to have a charter, it expires. And then the authorizer and the cyber charter school are supposed to come together and work through a reauthorization. Well, most of Pennsylvania's cyber charter schools are also operating with expired charters. So there is very, very little accountability for their spending, for their academics, or for anything, because there's nobody holding them accountable in Harrisburg.
So what is the administration or the Department of Education's answer to why that's the case? Are there just not enough resources for oversight over these schools?
I think it's partially a resource issue, and then I think we need to, look to the leadership, and I think we need to look to Governor Shapiro to see how many resources is he going to put behind holding the cyber charter schools in Pennsylvania accountable, because really the buck stops with him. And then also we need to look to our state legislature, and we need to ask, what are our state lawmakers doing to ensure that there will be accountability for cyber charters? Because state lawmakers could also enact a law that says you are not allowed to operate or get your charter renewed if you don't have regular financial audits, right? But right now, neither the legislature nor the governor's office is really doing anything to ensure accountability or transparency for any of Pennsylvania's cyber charter schools. And I think the result that we're seeing is that there is a feeling that they can kind of do whatever they want and spend money however they want. and it's really hard when those dollars are coming out of the pockets of people who are paying property taxes. And I know when I was on the school board, I knocked my doors. We had to raise taxes. There were people who were going without medicine because they couldn't pay their property taxes and buy their medicine. So they were paying their property taxes and they were going without medicine. And their property taxes are paying for things like people to have a cyber charter school, to have their executives sit at the Hill Society and go to lunch at Cork and Fork. Like, somebody in Harrisburg, it's time for them to step up, because everybody in Harrisburg is aware that this is going on. They need to start holding these schools accountable.
You said there's a number of schools operating with expired charters. So can you explain, number one, how long does a charter last? And number two, how does the school continue to operate if they don't have an up-to-date charter?
Yep. So a typical charter, when they issue it, would probably be 5 years, three to 5 years. And then, and I think this is also an issue with brick and mortar charter schools. The laws we have in Pennsylvania just allow for schools that have expired charters to continue to operate and to continue to collect payments from school districts. And it's very difficult to figure out what the leverage will be to get that cyber charter school or that charter school to come to the table to agree to the terms of the authorizer. And so it seems right now that, charter schools don't feel, the cyber charters, some of them don't feel like coming to the table to be held accountable, and there are no teeth in the law that will require that. And school districts are required to make payments to cyber charter schools, whether their charter is valid or whether it's expired. And so one of our recommendations out of the report is that no school district should be required to make a payment to a cyber charter unless it has a valid charter. If your charter is expired, then you should not be able to collect a single taxpayer dollar from any school district in the Commonwealth. We really feel strongly that that should get enacted into law.
You mentioned the governor and his having to act on this. What are your organization's thoughts on the latest budget, and is there any accountability built into this when it comes to charter schools?
So we really appreciate Governor Shapiro's very strong statement that we need to have the cyber charter tuition flat rate of $8,000 per student. It makes sense. It's what most other states do, right? Like, whether a student is sitting in the middle of the state or in the school district of Reading, that student's getting the same exact education over a computer, right? So one student's school district shouldn't be paying $22,000 while another school district pays $8,000. So, a flat tuition rate makes sense. And so we support that, and we appreciate Governor Shapiro's leadership on that. We would really like to see more leadership in the Department of Education, being empowered and having the staff that is necessary to really pull the cyber charters in, to have some conversations about what they need to do in order to have their charters renewed. And so I think that, we'll see during the budget hearings this year, are there additional staff put into the Department of Education? Do we start to see some of these renewals coming? And I'm really hopeful that Governor Shapiro, who has been somebody who has been a good government person, who has been a strong advocate for accountability, that he will really step into this space and, use the power he has to protect taxpayers and students.
You mentioned that the legislature also has to get involved.
Yep.
Should there be, you mentioned tying payments to these schools tied to a charter renewal. What does your organization think about putting moratoriums on new charter schools? Senator Williams introduced a bill that would basically put a moratorium on new charters until there's more oversight.
Yes, and we fully support a moratorium on any new cyber charter schools being approved in Pennsylvania. Until we have all of these current cyber charter schools renewed and accountable, the last thing our Department of Education needs to do is to entertain and spend hundreds of hours looking at applications from other cyber charter schools. And there was just one that applied. It was an AI cyber charter school where they were proud that there were no teachers, just guides. And so somebody in the department had to spend hundreds of hours reading the application and writing a denial for just a blatantly poorly written application that never should have been approved, but the number of hours and resources that went into denying it. And now the law allows that school to take all that advice and rewrite their application and come back and then drain more resources, right? So like, we just need a moratorium so that we can focus on the cyber charters we already have and get them held accountable.
Do you know how many charters are applied for every year, or is there any limit to the number of applications that can be sent?
I think anybody could apply to open a cyber charter school. There's an application period, so it closes. Last year there was this year there has been one. Typically there are not that many applications that come in, but I think Pennsylvania now is viewed as being pretty lucrative place to have a cyber charter school. So I would be surprised if we did not see an application or two every year kind of going forward. The department approved one a year or two ago. And then this was the next application that came in, and they denied this one.
Now, when you say lucrative, are you talking for-profit companies just look at this as a business to bring into Pennsylvania, and is the funding formula part of that equation?
Yeah, so yes, Pennsylvania's that formula that allows that mandates that school districts pay these enormously inflated tuition bills makes Pennsylvania a place where if you come in and you can get a few hundred students, you can be raking in millions of dollars, right? And no cyber charter school itself is allowed to be for profit, but a cyber charter school can have a management company that is a for-profit management company. And so once you get a for-profit management company managing the school, then you've got a real tension, right? Because if you're a for-profit company, your job is to make a profit, right? Not to educate kids. And so I do not know how many for-profit management companies there are in Pennsylvania that are operating cyber charter schools. I know there are a couple, but it's just for that AI cyber charter school, the amount of tuition they could collect in Pennsylvania was far more than the amount of tuition that they would collect in other states where they've been peddling their application. And so why wouldn't they come to Pennsylvania if they could make a lot more money here than they could make in, say, Arizona or Ohio?
How are these schools doing? How do the test scores compare to public schools or private schools now that we've had over a decade now of this in Pennsylvania? How do they compare to regular schools?
Yeah, they unfortunately have not done a very good job educating students. And when we look at what I think is the most important measure of a child's education, when we look at the graduation rates, cyber charter school graduation rates are just consistently very, very low compared to our traditional brick and mortar schools. So, there are 14 cyber charter schools. They all have different graduation rates. I would say you would land in the region of having about a 70% graduation rate at these schools, which means a lot of students who go into these schools do not graduate with a credential. And that is a tragedy for the child. And it is also really not good for the Commonwealth, because when we have a sector that's educating over 60,000 students and many of them just aren't going to graduate, that means that a lot of kids who we need to be productive workers, right? We need them to be able to go and be parts of our communities and be really productive. Without a graduation credential, it's a rough road for that kid, and it is not good for the Commonwealth as a whole.
What about Commonwealth Charter Academy, the one that your organization looked into? How do they do academically?
Not great. They are definitely a school that has been designated by federal standards as needing improvement. I don't remember their exact graduation rate. It's probably in the 65 to 70% range. And when you go, if you want to look at any of the schools, you can go to the Future Ready PA Index. It is the Pennsylvania Department of Education website where you can look at any school building in the entire Commonwealth and just look at student performance indicators. So what are their standardized test scores? What are their student growth rates? And CCA is one of the worst schools when it comes to looking at the standardized test scores and student achievement. And it's just, it's not good, right? It's not good for those kids. I think we all remember, I had kids in high school when we went online for COVID. Some kids do really, really well in an online environment. They thrive. It is like exactly what they need. But for many kids, it's just not going to be a place where they are able to like hold themselves accountable and learn. And I think that we need to grapple with this issue in Pennsylvania of how are we going to make sure that kids who are learning in an online environment are actually really learning and going to graduate, they're going to graduate and they're going to be successful after graduation.
So what's the next step? What should be done to make charter schools or cyber charter schools more accountable?
So I think everybody in Pennsylvania who feels like your property tax dollars should not be spent on things like dining out and entertainment, you need to talk to your state lawmakers, because it is our state lawmakers who are the ones who are going to make this decision. Last year, a huge bipartisan vote in the House. They passed enormous accountability measures and a tuition rate, flat rate. I think there were like 20-some Republicans who joined together with every Democrat. It was truly bipartisan, and then it got stalled in the Senate. And so really, truly, we need Republican senators in Pennsylvania to get on board with cyber charter reform and to stand up for like taxpayers and students and hold these schools accountable. And so my hope, and I'm very hopeful this year, is that the Senate in Pennsylvania will approve cyber charter reforms and say like enough is enough, like we're gonna take a step forward and we're gonna protect taxpayers and students. And so if you have a Republican senator or a Democratic senator, they need to hear from you, and they need to hear from you loud and clear that cyber charter reform has to happen this year.
All right. Susan Spicka, Education Voters of Pennsylvania, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.